The Hall of Concord was built to make lesser species feel honored before they realized they were being handled. The ceiling vanished into artificial weather. Soft white clouds drifted between suspended light arrays and gold-veined support arches so tall that the upper reaches of the chamber looked like a private sky someone had purchased for a ridiculous amount of money. The floor was polished black stone, reflective enough to turn every delegate into their own shadow. The air carried a faint floral note calculated to lower stress responses in 73 known species. Even the chairs were customized, each one proportioned to the body geometry, temperature preference, and spinal expectations of whoever sat in it. The Concorde had governed the central corridors of the galaxy for 419 years. They were very good at comfort. Ambassador Lena Vey walked through the main doors and did not look up. She had been in rooms like this for 23 years. She knew the ceiling was part of the machinery. You were supposed to notice the scale. You were supposed to feel your species reflected back at you as small, recent, provisional. You were supposed to absorb the unspoken message that history had already happened here and you were merely being allowed to stand inside it. Lena knew every version of that trick. She crossed the hall in a dark diplomatic uniform with no jewelry and almost no color, her translator bead humming softly at the base of her throat. At the far end of the chamber, seated at the great semicircular table beneath the Concorde seal, the senior delegates watched her approach with the collective stillness of people who believed they had already solved the conversation and were now waiting for the paperwork to catch up. At the center sat First Speaker Orenthal. He wore the Concorde blue and silver and held 4 of his 6 hands folded atop the table in what his species considered an open gesture of respect. The other 2 rested lightly on a ceremonial data slab. His expression was perfectly measured. Not warm. Warmth would imply equality. Not cold. Coldness would imply hostility. What he presented instead was the ancient imperial expression of benevolence extended downward. Lena sat. The ceremony lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. There were opening invocations in 12 languages. Then a reading of the Interstellar Colonial Sovereignty Accord, section by section, while her translation bead whispered the legal language into her ear in clean, flat English. Then a choral performance from a species whose voices sounded like crystal under pressure. Then a holographic display of orbital surveys, mineral maps, and climate projections rendered in tasteful muted colors that made the target world look harsh but noble, severe but promising, dangerous only in the abstract way rich people liked danger when it was very far away and belonged to someone else. The planet was called Veros 9. Lena already knew everything the Concorde had officially released about it. She also knew the things they had not. 3 months earlier, a source inside the Concorde Survey Archive had passed her a restricted environmental packet at a cost she had not yet decided how to repay. She had read it 6 times. She knew that Veros 9's atmosphere contained 2 upper chemical bands that would scar human lung tissue after 6 minutes of unfiltered exposure. She knew surface gravity was 1.31 standard, just enough to make every task harder and every injury slower to heal. She knew the day cycle ran 18 hours and swung from glacial cold to furnace heat between dawn and dusk. She knew the native biosphere secreted neurotoxic alkaloids through root systems that spread beneath the soil like a living minefield. She knew the local megafauna averaged 11 meters in height and had no natural fear response because nothing on Veros 9 had ever forced them to evolve one. The Concorde classified habitable worlds from Class 1 to Class 12 for public use. Classes 13 through 15 existed mostly in sealed files and cautionary annexes. Veros 9 was Class 15. And this morning, before the assembled delegates of the Concorde and half the diplomatic corps of the inner systems, it was being offered to humanity as a gift. Speaker Orenthal finished the final article and inclined his head by exactly the amount etiquette required. Ambassador Lena Vey, he said, his translated voice resonant enough to fill the hall without ever sounding loud. In recognition of humanity's growing importance to the shared future of the central corridors, the Concorde offers your people full and irrevocable colonial sovereignty over Veros 9. No Concorde tax authority. No resource extraction oversight. No territorial limitations. A world entirely your own. The chamber went still. Lena folded her hands once on the table and let the silence breathe. If someone had been watching only her face, they might have thought she was considering the honor of it. The scale. The generosity. The historic weight of being offered a whole world by the oldest and most stable governing body in known space. What she was actually thinking about was the manifest. 50,000 names. Engineers. Medics. Structural planners. Atmospheric chemists. Logistics staff. Teachers. Welders. Botanists. 3 musicians. 1 glass artist from Nairobi who had written in her application that if humanity was going to the edge of survivability, somebody should still be making beautiful things there. Lena thought about all of them. Then she looked at Speaker Orenthal and saw, for the briefest fraction of a second, what he thought he was hiding. Relief. Not generosity. Not pride. Relief. That was the moment the decision inside her settled into place. She reached for the accord. The biometric seal lit pale blue beneath her thumb. The human delegation accepts, she said. Around the table, the posture of the Concorde shifted almost imperceptibly. And that, more than the words or the ceremony or the artificial clouds drifting overhead, told Lena exactly how dangerous the gift really was. Lena did not sleep that night. Her assigned diplomatic quarters in the Concorde Embassy ring were, by any measurable standard, perfect. The mattress adjusted to muscle tension in real time. The air circulation system kept temperature within a quarter degree of her preferred range. The lighting dimmed itself in gentle gradients calibrated to human circadian preference. Outside the tall crescent window, the embassy plaza glowed with soft gold pathway lights and the constant motion of engineered fountains the Concorde maintained because studies had shown running water increased compliance responses in visiting delegations by nearly 8%. The Concorde had quantified comfort the way other civilizations quantified or yield. Lena sat at the narrow desk by the window with her shoes off, a cup of real coffee cooling beside her, and Veros 9 rotating slowly across the hollow display in front of her. Not the public presentation version from the hall. The real composite. Restricted atmosphere layers, classified biosphere notes, early hazard overlays, geological summaries, suppressed incident predictions. She had the public file open beside it, not because she needed to compare them anymore, but because the differences mattered. Public Veros 9 was severe but generous. Hard but conquerable. A proving ground. A frontier world. The classified Veros 9 was a sentence. She magnified the landing basin again. The Concorde survey had marked it as stable enough for first phase deployment. Manageable environmental stressors, the public file called it. The restricted version flagged pressure wind interactions strong enough to roll heavy structures if the anchor load was calculated even slightly wrong. The valley floor appeared barren at first glance, but beneath the surface ran dense root lattices of native growths carrying a contact toxin that would chew through worn boot seals and crawl into the bloodstream before a field medic finished swearing. The mountain shadows on the western ridge, so dramatic in the official colonial brochure, masked the migration routes of megafauna whose mass profiles made a mockery of standard deterrent barriers. Someone in the Concorde had taken all of that and decided it would make an excellent gift. Lena lifted the coffee and drank it cold. She had spent the better part of 3 years understanding why. The Concorde did not usually remove problems loudly. Loud problems attracted history. Their preferred method was administrative. Procedural. Elegant. A clause in one accord. A reclassification in another. A sovereign transfer here, a jurisdictional carve-out there. By the time the damage surfaced, it surfaced as distance, bad luck, regrettable attrition in a difficult environment, the unavoidable cost of expansion beyond the comfortable reach of civilization. Humanity had become a problem 11 years ago, though not in the way the Concorde had first expected. Humans did not win cleanly enough to be reassuring. They made allies in places that were meant to stay isolated. They asked after sealed archives. They inserted themselves into disputes the Concorde preferred to leave unresolved because unresolved border tensions were efficient management tools. 2 years earlier, a human mediation team had ended a resource conflict between the Narithi and the Call, undoing 40 years of beautifully maintained strategic hostility in less than 5 months. The peace itself had been praised publicly. Quietly, Inside Concord planning circles, it had triggered a level of concern normally reserved for insurgencies. Humanity made systems less predictable. The offer of Veros 9 had followed 8 months later. Lena expanded another file. The Colonial Manifest appeared in orderly columns, 50,000 names deep. She had read every one of them. Not because it would change the vote. The vote had already been managed by the time the offer reached the ceremonial stage. She read them because numbers blurred and people did not. Aaron Solis, structural engineer, age 51, previous work on Chicago undergrid stabilization. Priya Nwosu, trauma surgeon, Lagos Orbital Emergency Network. Mateo Barrera, hydrology specialist. Jules Hart, systems welding. Nia Velez, teacher. Jonah Pike, agricultural chemistry. Mara Dune, musician. Tova Aaron, glass artist. 50,000 lives the Concorde had converted into a logistic solution. She had thought, many times, about warning them directly before embarkation. That was the temptation that returned hardest in the sleepless hours. Send a full brief. Break protocol. Tell them everything. The atmosphere. The flora. The fauna. The fact that no species with options would ever choose a Class 15 world voluntarily. Tell them the offer itself was proof of intent. But she had carried that thought all the way to its end and found only worse outcomes waiting there. If humanity refused Veros 9 publicly, the Concorde would not suddenly grow honest. It would recalculate. Perhaps another world. Perhaps a colonial accident en route. Perhaps 12 committee delays and a quietly vanished appropriation line. The cruelty would remain. Only the evidence would not. Better a trap with witnesses. Better a death world with 50,000 humans building records from the inside than 50,000 names reduced to memorial statements and unanswered inquiries. That was the choice she had made in the hall. Not acceptance. Placement. She opened the first of the hidden channels. 3 years earlier, before the offer had fully taken shape but after she had begun to suspect its direction, she had started laying wire without using wire. One research contact outside Concorde jurisdiction. Then a freight coordinator in the outer relay zones. Then a legal archivist from a species the Concorde still categorized as administratively minor, which was often the category under which the most useful people learned to survive. One by one, careful and deniable, she built a route through individuals rather than systems. Small agreements. Favors. Quiet trades. Nothing dramatic. Nothing traceable at a glance. The kind of network that did not exist until the day it suddenly did. Tonight she loaded the first packet. Atmospheric analysis, full version. Restricted terrain hazards. Emergency frequency list. Independent contacts by region. Translation keys. Redundant routing instructions. Then she added a plain text document of her own, stripped of accusation and almost stripped of emotion. Facts only. The accord language that mattered. Article references. Specific clauses. The exact sentence buried in subsection wording that exempted the Concorde from mandatory intervention obligations once colonial sovereignty was accepted. She wrote it the way engineers liked emergency manuals written, clear, calm, and impossible to misunderstand once the moment came. She did not send it immediately. The transports had not yet cleared Concorde-controlled relay space. Timing mattered. Too early, and the message would be intercepted. Too late, and the colony would lose days it could not afford. She sat back, listening to the artificial fountains beyond the glass. The plaza below was peaceful in the precise synthetic way all Concorde peace was peaceful. Controlled light. Controlled water. Controlled sound. The entire district existed to make visitors feel that order and mercy were the natural byproducts of long power. Lena watched the water and thought about 50,000 people boarding ships for a world chosen because it was supposed to finish them quietly. Then she checked the departure window one more time, marked the relay threshold, and waited for the first moment when truth could leave the embassy faster than the Concorde could catch it. The colony ships reached Veros 9 after 19 days in transit. From orbit, the planet looked bruised. Brown, purple, and iron-gray bands twisted around one another in atmospheric layers that seemed to rotate according to separate arguments. 3 fragmented asteroid rings caught the local star at awkward angles and flashed briefly beautiful before vanishing back into dark. No moon. No soft light. No familiar geometry for the human eye to lean on. Just a world that looked, from the first glance, like it had already survived something and not become friendlier for it. Inside the observation gallery of the lead transport, no one talked much. They stood shoulder to shoulder against the port glass and stared down. Aaron Solis stood near the back with his daughter Lena pressed against one side of him, both of them still in transit clothes, both of them holding helmets they would need in less than 6 hours. Aaron had spent 20 years doing infrastructure emergency work in the underlevels of Chicago, which meant his first instinct in the face of scale was not awe but subdivision. He did not look at Veros 9 and think world. He looked at projected landing zones, bedrock load, anchor stress, seal risk, corridor routing, available redundancy. The northern basin came up on the screen beside the window. Flat enough for first-wave deployment. Shielded on the west by natural ridges. Aquifer signatures within drilling range. Surface winds classified as severe but manageable in the public file. Aaron had read the restricted update that arrived through Ambassador Lena Vey's relay chain halfway through transit, and he knew severe but manageable translated to if you anchor badly, the planet will teach you about torque by removing your walls. Dad? Lena said quietly. Yeah. It looks mean. He considered lying. He decided not to. It looks busy, he said instead. Mean is when you don't get warning. She accepted that with the solemnity of a 10-year-old who had already understood, without being told directly, that adults were doing a lot of pretending on this trip and not all of it was useful. At the front of the gallery, a jazz musician named Marcus Webb sat in a window seat with a small notebook on one knee and a saxophone case under the other hand. He had signed up because the brochure mentioned mountains. That fact had become a quiet joke among the colonists who knew him, though no one laughed much now. He was not an engineer or a medic or an agronomist. He had no practical frontier skill anyone could point to on a chart. But Lena Vey had read his application before departure, seen the line where he wrote that places became human when someone stayed long enough to make music there, and approved him herself. Marcus pressed his forehead lightly to the glass and watched the cloud systems turn. It looks like a bruise, he murmured. No one answered. The landing sequence began 3 hours later and took the better part of a day. 6 transport hulls dropped in staggered descent windows, each one riding the atmosphere hard enough to make the frame shudder. Dust and mineral grit blasted outward in enormous brown halos as the landing struts hit. The first ship sank almost a meter deeper than the simulations had predicted before finding purchase in the rock beneath the surface crust. By the second touchdown, Aaron was already recalculating anchor assumptions on a borrowed engineering slate while still strapped into his crash harness. The domes deployed in the order they had practiced 41 times in simulation and never once under actual Veros 9 gravity. Cargo bays opened. Prefabricated supports unfolded. Atmospheric processors lowered on crane rigs. Ground teams moved in full environment suits through dust so thick it turned the floodlights into smears. Nobody said it out loud, but there was a moment, roughly 17 minutes into deployment, when every person on the basin floor understood exactly how fragile their existence currently was. Not philosophically. Mechanically. A seal failure. A valve jam. One cracked coupling under pressure and 50,000 people on a gift world became a report. The first dome went breathable at 14:32 local basin time. The announcement hit every internal comm channel at once. Filtered atmosphere stable. Partial pressure acceptable. Helmet removal authorized within Zone 1. The sound that followed inside the temporary entry corridor was not cheering. It was the long, involuntary exhale of people who had been carrying their lungs like borrowed equipment for too many hours. Lena got her helmet off and laughed once at the feel of ordinary air, even the machine-made version of it. Marcus Webb took 3 breaths and immediately wrote down, "It smells like filters, glue, dust, and the beginning of a city." For a few hours, the colony allowed itself the smallest possible amount of relief. Then Dome 3 failed. The breach started in a junction panel on the east access seam where one of the lower supports had taken extra impact during touchdown. Under Earth standard conditions it might have held for weeks before inspection found the stress line. Under Veros 9's pressure differentials and particulate load, it lasted until 1907. The seam split. The pressure warning went red. External atmosphere punched through for 11 seconds before emergency closure protocols slammed shut. 11 seconds was enough. 7 people were in the direct exposure corridor. 3 died before the medics reached them. 2 more died in triage. The remaining 2 lasted under 40 minutes. No one who saw it ever used the word accident again without hearing how small it sounded. By night cycle, the colony understood the world in the only language worlds like Veros 9 respected. The first dead were laid out in a converted cargo section because the memorial space had not yet been assembled. Engineers reran every seal load calculation. Medical staff issued updated exposure protocols. The exhausted people in Dome 1 spoke in careful voices and avoided looking too long at the sectioned-off wall where Dome 3's corridor had been sealed. Aaron did not sleep. He sat in the engineering bay with 3 screens open, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside his hand, and 32 new stress models layered over the old ones. The public Concorde specs had assumed rock density that did not exist here, particulate loads lower than reality, and strain tolerances that now looked suspiciously optimistic. Around him, his team moved with the blunt, focused quiet of people who knew grief would still be there later but the bolts needed torque now. Reinforce every external seam, he said. We don't have enough plating for every seam, someone answered. Then reinforce the load-bearing ones and redesign the others. With what? Aaron looked at the print queue, the cargo manifest, the disassembled support braces from a storage assembly they no longer needed in original form. With whatever stops this from happening twice. Outside the dome walls, Veros 9 rotated through another harsh dark-bright cycle and continued being exactly what it had always been. Inside, 50,000 humans began the long work of refusing to die on schedule. Day 2 was quieter than Day 1, but only because on Day 1 nobody yet understood what quiet on Veros 9 actually meant. Quiet did not mean safe. Quiet meant the colony had not yet triggered the next failure mode. The dead from Dome 3 had names on the internal memorial board by 0600 Basin time. Nobody held a formal service because nobody had the hours to surrender and still keep the dome standing. The names went up. People looked at them while passing through the main corridor. Some stopped. Most did not. The work queue had already reorganized itself around the assumption that grief would have to move in parallel with survival. By 0800, Aaron Solis had 3 engineering teams on external seam reinforcement, 1 on anchor load redistribution, and 1 trying to teach the fabrication printers to produce a seal lattice they had not been designed to produce from materials they had not been intended to use. Veros 9's gravity took every task and added a tax to it. Not enough to stop you outright. Just enough to turn each lift into labor and every hour into a bill your joints would eventually collect on. The outer perimeter markers went up at noon. They were not defensive in any serious sense. Just a first-wave sensor line, beacon stakes and motion posts set in a rough ring beyond the initial dome cluster so the colony could at least know what was approaching before it arrived close enough to become immediate. The public Concorde fauna file had marked the local megafauna as migratory and generally non-aggressive. Aaron had read that file and, after the restricted packet from Lena Vey, translated generally non-aggressive into large enough that aggression would be a secondary concern. At 1742, the perimeter line reported movement from the eastern flats. Marcus Webb was in Dome 1 unpacking sheet music into a locker he had already decided was too small for the life he intended to live here when the first alarm sounded. The tone had not yet acquired meaning in him, so for a half-second it was just sound. Then the corridor lights went amber. The internal speakers snapped to attention with the clipped, overcom voice of the emergency system. Outer perimeter contact. Sector East. All exterior teams returned to sealed zones immediately. The second alert came 10 seconds later, and the wording changed. Barrier contact. Mass profile exceeds projection. That got everyone moving. Through the east observation ports, the colony saw them for the first time. The lead animal was 12 meters if it was an inch, gray-brown under the failing light with a head broad enough to look architectural rather than biological. It moved with the steady indifference of something that had never in its evolutionary history needed to hurry for anyone. Behind it came 4 more, then 7, then enough that counting felt less useful than accepting the category. A migration line. Slow. Fast. Certain. The perimeter stakes disappeared under their feet as though they had been placed in grass. No charge. No roar. No hostility in any dramatic human sense. Just motion. The colony was in the way of that motion. One of the outer equipment sheds went down first. The lead creature clipped it with a shoulder broad enough to qualify as impact infrastructure, and the shed collapsed into the dust without achieving the dignity of resistance. The emergency barrier system, assembled in a hurry from standard Class 8 fauna deterrents, activated on schedule and discharged a crackling electromagnetic pulse line across the eastern perimeter. The creatures noticed. That was all. They did not panic, did not scatter, did not even accelerate. They registered discomfort the way a person registered unpleasant weather and kept walking. The first dome wall flexed inward under the pressure wave of one animal brushing the support struts while trying to follow the route it had apparently been following for years before humans ever arrived. People inside the dome screamed not because the wall broke, but because it moved enough to remind them that it could. Aaron arrived in the engineering command bay already pulling up structural stress maps. "Kill the Class 8 pattern," he said. "It's useless." "What do you want instead?" One of his team snapped back, not argumentative, just desperate for a vector. "I want a field strong enough to convince something that size it has better things to do." That's not a specification. It is now. The next 3 hours settled into the kind of chaos incident reports always lied about afterward. Organized response. Managed threat migration. Minimal structural loss. The actual recordings were all hard breathing and shouted calculations, and one medic in the East Corridor yelling for someone to stop trying to save a barrier post that had already folded in half. 12 people died before the line finally diverted. 3 in the collapsed shed. 2 in a ground vehicle that overturned while trying to reposition a field emitter. 4 in an exterior retrieval team caught too far from the airlock when the migration crossed their return path. 3 more from blunt trauma and pressure injuries during the perimeter crush. By midnight, the basin was quiet again in the Vero's 9 sense of the word. The dead count stood at 19 since landing. Marcus sat on an equipment crate with his saxophone across his knees and watched engineers move through the bay carrying coils, posts, fractured plating, and a species-specific amount of exhausted anger. He did not play. It would have felt dishonest. Near the far wall, Aaron stood in front of a projected terrain map while 6 people argued around him about field strength, anchor placement, and the exact path the creatures had taken across the flats. He did not raise his voice once. "They weren't attacking," Aaron said finally. Nobody answered because nobody liked the sound of that sentence. "They were following a route. Our mistake was building like routes wouldn't matter." "They walked through a barrier grid," one of the systems engineers said. "No," Aaron replied. "They walked through a barrier grid designed by people who had never seen them." He zoomed the terrain outward, overlaying the migration line with the colony's footprint. The route did not curve toward the domes. The domes had been dropped directly across it. That changed the problem. Not solved it. Changed it. By 3:10, the perimeter redesign existed in draft. Wider field anchors. Layered emitters tuned to sustain discouragement rather than high-intensity shock. Buffer corridors. Motion-aware spacing. A western detour lane left intentionally open, on the theory that even very large creatures would prefer the easier path if given one. "We've worked with worse," Aaron said when the final schematic locked in. It was not true. Everyone in the room knew it was not true. But the phrase landed the way a brace lands under weight, not elegant, just necessary. No one contradicted him. Morning brought the second lesson. The cinnamon smell. Ground crews had noticed it during landing but filed it under background environment because there had not been room in anyone's brain for one more hazard. By day 3, the surface scouts started reporting blisters around the ankles where suit seals had worn thin. Then numbness in the hands. Then one driller, a woman named May Caro, lost control of her right leg halfway back from an aquifer survey and only stayed upright because the technician beside her physically dragged her through the airlock before the muscles fully stopped responding. Xenobiology pulled samples from the reddish-gold grass mats covering the lower basin and found a root toxin efficient enough to make everyone briefly speechless. It smelled sweet. It looked harmless. It was in everything. By the end of the day, protocols changed again. Better seal inspections. Ground scanners recalibrated for root density. Red maps for no-step zones. Boot replacement moved to high priority. Children confined indoors until someone could define indoors with more confidence. The colony did not celebrate any victory that first month. It adapted. That was harsher and more useful. By the end of week 1, the perimeter held once. By the end of week 2, Dome 3's redesigned seals had not failed again. By the end of week 3, people had started saying East Migration instead of the night the giants came, which was the first sign that terror had been processed into logistics. The Deathworld was still trying to kill them. But now, finally, humanity was learning the order in which it preferred to try. Month 1 ended with 89 dead. No one announced the number aloud over the colony channel. It appeared instead in the daily systems bulletin between water recovery percentages and fabrication output, the way numbers appeared when everyone understood that saying them slowly into a microphone would not make them kinder. 89 from an initial manifest of 50,000. Dome failure. Atmospheric exposure. Fauna impact. Toxin breach. 2 medical emergencies that would have been survivable on Earth and were not survivable here because Veros 9 had a way of charging interest on every small weakness at once. Then the curve began, very slightly, to flatten. That was the first real victory. Not safety. Not comfort. Not even confidence. Just proof that the colony had stopped falling as fast as the planet wanted it to. Aaron Solis saw the curve before anyone else because he was the kind of man who trusted trend lines more than speeches. At 5:12 on day 32, with coffee cooling beside one hand and a maintenance alert blinking ignored in the corner of his slate, he overlaid casualty frequency against seal stability, perimeter integrity, medical response time, and external work protocol revisions. The line still went down, but not steeply anymore. He looked at it for a long time. Then he forwarded the chart to Dr. Priya Nwosu in Med, to hydroponics, to external operations, to logistics, to every team lead who had spent the last month operating on too little sleep and too much necessity. No message attached. He did not need one. People on Veros 9 had gotten very good at reading what mattered in silence. The colony's perimeter redesign held through the next eastward migration. That alone shifted the emotional geometry of the place. The upgraded field anchors went in at triple depth, bolted through surface instability into the bedrock below. The deterrence array stopped trying to punish the megafauna and instead made the colony expensive to cross. Low-frequency discomfort. Magnetic interference. Directional pressure strong enough to suggest an easier route without triggering the sort of panic that made large bodies do stupid things. Aaron's western detour lane, mocked by 2 younger systems techs as the polite suggestion corridor, turned out to work. The lead animal reached the field edge, stopped, and stood there so long that the observers in the engineering bay started doubting the sensors. Then it turned. Not away. Around. One by one the rest of the migration followed, tracing the edge of the deterrent field until they reached the gap in the west and passed along it in a slow, impossible file of muscle and ancient patience. No dome walls flexed. No alarms went red. No one died. In the observation corridor, Marcus Webb had his saxophone with him for no reason he could explain afterward. When the last of the creatures vanished along the detour ridge, he lifted the instrument halfway to his mouth, thought better of it, and just stood there with tears in his eyes for a minute while the people around him tried not to react too visibly to the fact that they had just watched a death world choose to go around them. They did not call it hope. They called it progress because progress was a word adults trusted more. The air systems improved next. Priya Nwosu's medical center had begun life in a converted cargo spine with curtain partitions and equipment that still smelled like shipping foam. By month 2 it had become an actual clinic with triage lanes, sterilization units, respiratory support, and a rhythm harsh enough to qualify as medicine anywhere civilization existed. Priya ran it with the exact tone she had once used in emergency departments in Lagos Orbital. If you were breathing, then there was work to do. If you were not breathing, there was still work to do, just faster. She had 62 medical staff. She needed at least 90. She made do by inventing shifts that would have violated labor law on any world rich enough to care about labor law. Nobody complained. Complaints took energy, and energy had become a currency everyone preferred to spend on survival. The new atmospheric processors arrived online gradually rather than dramatically. Extra filtration stages. Improved corrosive particulate stripping. Toxin screening. Humidity balancing. Tiny changes in internal dome composition that made the air less like something manufactured under protest and more like something the lungs could stop arguing with. Priya noticed the result first not in the major cases but in the annoyingly ordinary ones. Less coughing in the mornings. Fewer headaches at shift turnover. Lower inflammation markers. Children sleeping longer. She wrote all of it down. On Veros 9, one of the first luxuries people relearned was record keeping. When a place was trying this hard to kill you, data became a kind of prayer. Hydroponics was where the colony first allowed itself to become offended by the planet instead of merely afraid of it. The public Concord material had used the phrase challenging agricultural adaptation window, which turned out to mean that most Earth strains looked at Veros 9's filtered sunlight profile and reacted like insulted aristocrats asked to garden in acid. Leaves yellowed. Root structures stalled. Fruit set failed. 2 early crop trays collapsed into fungus because the thermal cycle in the secondary dome had been modeled for a world that obeyed simpler physics. Then the hydroponics team stopped asking what was supposed to work and started asking what would. That was more human anyway. Raji Menon, who had trained as a food systems scientist and had the spiritual temperament of an engineer who happened to specialize in edible things, spent 6 weeks crossbreeding under pressure. Earth spinach with a filtered native analog that tasted like old copper. Protein mosses with fast cycle nutrient gels. Root vegetables adjusted for the gravity load and wrong spectrum light. She failed repeatedly, documented each failure with insulting precision, and continued. By month 3, she produced a broad-leafed green that survived Veros 9 conditions without trying to die theatrically. "It's not good," she announced to the first tasting group. Aaron chewed carefully, stared at the sample on his fork, and said, "It tastes like ambition." Raji folded her arms. "It has a nutritional profile that makes spinach look like decorative foliage." Then put it in the meal rotation. The leaf mass entered Colony Food Service under the deeply uninspired name car salad, which began as a joke and stuck because humanity never met a naming opportunity it could resist reducing to convenience. No one loved it. Everyone ate it. That was enough. Somewhere in the 3rd month, the colony crossed the invisible threshold between emergency camp and place. Nobody announced that either. It happened the way all real settlements happen, by accumulation of things no one would prioritize if survival were still measured strictly hour to hour. A school opened in an unused partition of Dome 2 because there were 63 children in the colony, and leaving them to educate one another indefinitely had begun to feel less like rugged adaptability and more like negligence. 2 teachers partitioned the space with storage walls and acoustic curtains and started lessons beneath lighting too bright for comfort and too dim for ideal cognition. Lena Solis, now old enough to understand fear but young enough to metabolize it into questions, sat in the oldest group and developed the irritating habit of asking things that made adults stop and think before answering. The market appeared without permission in Corridor 4. At first it was just surplus. Extra bolts from fabrication. A packet of coffee traded for spare boot seals. Somebody's successful basil culture for somebody else's repaired heater mesh. Then one Tuesday there were 7 people set up along the wall. The next Tuesday there were 14. By month 4 the corridor had become a market in the ancient human way, because enough people kept showing up with things and no one had the energy to stop them. An older crop scientist sold soil amendments no one fully understood but everyone agreed seemed to help. 2 machinists traded tool grips printed to fit Vero's gloved hands. Someone began making ceramic mugs because drinking from polymer forever had been identified as a morale issue. Marcus Webb played in the corner with impossible acoustics and no commercial sense. The saxophone bounced off the dome walls in warm, broken echoes that turned the corridor briefly into something close to memory. After months of alarms, warning tones, seal hiss, and medical monitors, the sound of someone playing Autumn badly but sincerely felt like the colony insisting on a future. No one asked him to stop. Even Priya Nwosu, who normally treated all non-essential corridor congestion as a personal insult, let the market exist because she had finally learned the difference between inefficiency and civilization. The strangest shifts were physiological. By month 5, Priya's respiratory panel anomalies were no longer ignorable. Lena had not needed her inhaler in weeks. Not once. Her lung function had climbed into ranges that did not make sense for a child with her file history. Priya reran the tests herself, then had another physician rerun them without telling him what she expected. Same result. Not just stable. Improved. She checked 3 other colonists with chronic respiratory conditions. 2 showed gains. 1 had no change. The 4th, a systems welder with a history of inflammatory airway collapse, had metrics so unexpectedly strong that Priya spent 10 full minutes checking the calibration on the scanner before accepting that reality had, once again, failed to consult expectations. "It's the processors," Aaron said when she told him. "No, it isn't," Priya replied. "What else would it be?" She looked past him through the medbay partition at Veros 9's filtered brown light pressing against the dome shell. "That?" she said, and hated how speculative it sounded. Outside the dome, the world continued being lethal. Inside, people kept living anyway. That was the thing the Concord had not understood. A death world could not remain merely a death world once humans had enough time to start naming its grasses, mapping its animals, adjusting its air, teaching its children, building corridors, making bad music in bad acoustics, and putting awful vegetables on the menu because awful vegetables were still victory if they kept the number from going down. By the end of month 5, the number had not only stabilized. For the first time since landfall, it twitched upward. 5 births. Aaron looked at the updated graph in the engineering bay and did not smile, because smiling would have made it into sentiment and sentiment wasted time. But he touched the screen once with 2 fingers, very lightly, as if verifying the curve was real. Then he went back to work. Because on Veros 9, even miracles had to be integrated into the schedule. The birth that mattered most happened on day 147. The storms started before dawn. On Veros 9, storms did not announce themselves with rain first. They announced themselves with pressure. A deep, gathering heaviness in the dome walls. A change in the sound of the air processors. The faintest flex in sealed joints that made experienced colonists lift their heads and listen the way sailors listen to rigging. By 4:10 local cycle, the outer hull sensors were already reporting crosswind escalation from the southern basin. By 4:23, static charge had started building in the upper atmosphere. By 4:31, the medbay was operating under stormlock protocol, which meant no unnecessary movement between domes, no external maintenance, and all critical staff sleeping in chairs if they could. Priya Nwosu had not slept in the chair. She had a laboring patient. Imani Dada lay on the medbay's central delivery platform with her jaw clenched, her breath controlled, and one hand gripping the rail hard enough to leave half-moons in the composite surface. She had hidden the pregnancy through the final selection cycle not because she was careless, but because she was the best structural materials engineer on the outbound list and she knew exactly how selection boards behaved when presented with reasons to make practical decisions about women's futures. Priya had found out in week 2 of transit. She had kept it off record. Not illegally, exactly. Just humanly. Now, 147 days into a Class 15 colonization, with the storm hammering the dome shell and the medbay lights flickering once every 17 seconds under grid strain, Imani brought the first child ever born on Veros 9 into the world. The baby arrived furious. That pleased Priya immediately. A weak baby frightened her. A quiet baby frightened her. An outraged baby with strong lungs and a full-bodied protest against existence was, on the whole, a much better sign. The infant came out slick with blood and heat and life, screamed as though personally offended by the lighting, and clenched both fists before Priya had even finished clearing the airway. "Good," Priya murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Imani, drenched in sweat and halfway gone with exhaustion, laughed once and cried immediately afterward. "What is it?" "A child," Priya said. "And apparently one with opinions." By 5:02 the mother was stable. By 5:09 the baby was wrapped, assessed, weighed, and placed briefly on Imani's chest. By 5:17 the name was chosen. Mark. 32 minutes after birth, with the storm still shaking the medbay shell in intermittent low-bodied impacts, a technician named Obi Kareem made a mistake. Later, for the record, it would be described as a maintenance sequence misfire during secondary ventilation diagnostics. That was accurate in the way official language was sometimes accurate while still failing to contain the reality of a thing. In human terms, Obi had been awake too long, the storm had scrambled 3 routine systems into one another, and he hit the wrong confirmation string on a panel he had operated flawlessly for 4 months. A maintenance seal in the secondary ventilation spine opened. It should have cycled the internal recycling loop. Instead it peeled open the outer vent. Unfiltered Vero's 9 atmosphere entered Medbay 1 for 4.3 seconds. The alarm hit instantly. Red lights. Seal clamp shriek. Emergency closure. Everyone in the room moving before thought had fully caught up. Priya turned before the sound finished and saw exactly where the open vent was pointed. Examination Table 3. Mark. The baby lay there under a thermal arch with her tiny chest rising and falling in that rapid, effortless rhythm newborns used because breathing was still more reflex than labor. The external air reached her first. It touched the side of her face and the open line of her mouth and the small wet authority of lungs that did not yet know caution. She inhaled. Twice. Then the vent slammed shut. Filtered atmosphere returned with a violent rush. The alarm continued. Obi was already at the wall panel trying to reverse what had already been reversed, sobbing openly now, saying, "No, no, no," as though repetition could bargain with chemistry. A nurse dropped the respiratory kit because her hand hit the trolley too hard. Imani tried to sit up and Priya had to physically force her back down with one forearm while crossing the room in the same motion. For one terrible instant, the entire medbay became a held breath. Everyone in it knew the public file. Everyone in it knew the restricted addendum, too, because Priya had made sure her staff did not practice medicine here under illusions. Vero's 9 atmosphere was not survivable for human tissue. Not for adults. Not for children. Certainly not for a child born 32 minutes earlier whose lungs had never breathed anything at all except filtered dome air and instinct. Priya reached the table. Amara was breathing. That by itself was not enough to mean anything. Bodies sometimes continued for a few seconds after damage had already won. Priya snatched up the scanner pad and ran the first assessment. Airway clear. Oxygenation stable. No visible burn response. No acute inflammation. She frowned and ran it again. Same result. "Doctor?" one of the nurses whispered. Priya did not answer. She ran the assessment a 3rd time, then a 4th, each pass slower, meaner, more personal, as though if she checked with enough hostility the machine would stop insulting her training. But every line came back the same. Heart rate normal for neonatal distress. Lung intake strong. Tissue response unremarkable. No blistering. No collapse. No chemical burn. No catastrophic anything. Amara sneezed once, made a small irritated sound, and continued being alive. Obi had sunk all the way to the floor by then. "I killed her," he said, staring at nothing. "I killed." "No," Priya said sharply. The whole room looked at her. She was staring at the scanner readout as if it had become personally offensive. "No, you did not." Imani's voice came from the bed, thin but steady with the dangerous steadiness of a mother too frightened to permit softness. "My baby." Priya turned, crossed back to her, and placed the wrapped infant into her arms. Amara rooted once against the blanket, opened her mouth, and took another deep, easy breath. Human infant. 32 minutes old. Exposed to 4.3 seconds of hostile unfiltered class 15 atmospheric mix. No injury observed. The sentence formed in Priya's head with clinical neatness, and she hated it because there was no clinical neatness big enough for what had just happened. Outside the med bay, the storm continued to pound the dome as if Veros 9 had decided on principle that there should be no witnesses to miracles. Inside, the first child born on the Deathworld slept against her mother's chest and breathed air that should have killed her. By shift change, Priya had already locked the room, quarantined the sensor logs, and initiated a xenobiology review under 3 different research tags because she did not yet know which one would let her say impossible in a way the data would tolerate. By the end of the day, every senior department head in the colony had heard some version of the story. By the end of the week, Aaron Solis had read the preliminary report twice and then sat in silence with the scanner output projected over his desk. At the top of the page, under incident type, the system had generated the blandest phrase possible. Brief atmospheric anomaly. Aaron read that phrase for a long time. Then he looked through the engineering bay window at the brown-purple sky of Veros 9 and understood that whatever this world really was, the Concord had lied about more than danger. The anomaly report took 9 weeks to stop looking like an error and start looking like a fact. Priya Nwosu did not trust facts that arrived wearing the shape of miracles. Miracles were for tired people and bad historians. Medicine required uglier, more durable things. Repeatability. Baselines. Controls. Blood work. Respiratory panels. Tissue scans. Longitudinal observation. She approached Amara's survival the same way she approached every event on Veros 9 that did not immediately fit inside known categories, by assuming first that something in the room was lying. The room, unfortunately, kept refusing. At 2 weeks old, Amara's lungs showed no scarring. At 4 weeks, still none. At 6 weeks, still none. At 9 weeks, Priya ran the atmospheric resistance panel herself in the medbay after everyone else had gone off shift and the generators had settled into their lower night hum. She calibrated the instruments twice. She checked the seal on the test chamber. She repeated the sequence once with filtered control air and once with a diluted atmospheric sample that should have produced measurable distress even in adults with healthy lungs. Amara yawned. That was what finally unnerved Priya. Not resistance. Yawning. By the end of the 9th week, the report was 300 pages of charts, incident logs, comparative physiology, and increasingly offended technical language. The final conclusion had been rewritten 7 times because every version sounded either too dramatic or too timid. Priya settled at last on wording she hated only slightly less than the alternatives. Observed neonatal respiratory tolerance to hostile local atmosphere cannot currently be explained by known human physiological models. She almost left it there. Then she added the line that mattered. This should not be possible. The report went out through Ambassador Lena Vey's independent relay network under full encryption. Priya attached no commentary, no request, no speculation. There was nothing to say that the data did not already say more cleanly than she could. What changed on the colony side was subtler. Parents heard about Amara first in whispers and then in the way all closed populations eventually heard everything, through practical gossip dressed as concern. By the end of month 6, half the colony knew there was a baby in Medbay 1 who had breathed Veros 9 air and gone on being healthy out of sheer disrespect for medical consensus. By the end of year 1, the rumor had become one of those local truths people no longer argued about even if they did not understand it. By year 2, there were 4 more children with respiratory patterns that Priya could not fit into any Earth origin expectations. Lena Solis was not one of them, but she came close enough to irritate the entire concept of precedent. Her asthma had all but vanished. When Aaron first mentioned it to Priya, he did so in the tone of a man asking whether he had overlooked some obvious maintenance explanation for his daughter's lungs suddenly deciding to become elite equipment. Priya reran the full panel and stared at the results in silence. The old airway inflammation was gone. The chronic reactivity that had followed Lena since childhood had flattened into statistical normalcy. It might have been the processors. It might have been some unknown interaction between local atmosphere and filtration chemistry. It might have been something buried deeper in the environmental profile. Priya wrote all 3 possibilities down and believed none of them fully. Veros 9 was changing the colonists. Slowly. Selectively. Without permission. Outside the domes, the world kept teaching them other things. The megafauna migration maps turned into something closer to a language. Felix Oren, the colony ecologist who had begun by tracking routes simply to keep people from being crushed in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour, spent year 2 and most of year 3 noticing patterns he did not initially trust himself to name. The largest creatures did not just move. They chose. The western detour route introduced after the first migration failure was no longer merely tolerated. It had become part of the herd behavior. The lead animals stopped at the perimeter edge, assessed, and rerouted with a consistency that suggested not instinct alone, but some battered remainder of negotiated space. Lena started volunteering with Felix's team because she asked better questions than some adults and had developed the patience to sit still beside the deterrent boundary for 2 hours without inventing reasons to move. On a cold bright afternoon in year 3, she sat cross-legged behind the field line and watched the largest of the East Route animals halt 20 meters out and stare at the colony with reflective window-like eyes. "It knows where we are," Felix said softly, more to his recorder than to her. "No," Lena replied. "It knows who we are." Felix wrote the sentence down because he had learned by then that children and exhausted scientists often arrived at the dangerous truths by the same side door. The colony's own dangerous truth arrived through mining. Aaron had been pushing for a deep strata survey since year 2. Solar and surface geothermal would not carry them forever. The fabrication yards were already eating more power than first-wave projections allowed, and if Veros 9 was going to be home instead of extended emergency housing, then home would eventually need industry. Industry needed or stable substrata and something better than guesswork. The drill drones went out in month 37. 6 units. 12 kilometers depth target. Spread across the northern basin and adjacent ridgelines. The first data sets were excellent. Better than excellent. Mineral deposits, dense and distributed. Rare conductive veins. Structural rock strong enough to support long-term extraction if they could solve the machinery where problem the local particulate environment kept inflicting on every moving surface. Aaron read the first packet at 7:03 Basin time with his second coffee of the day and felt, for exactly 2 minutes, the quiet satisfaction of a man whose long boring arguments about future manufacturing capacity had just been vindicated. Then the anomaly flags arrived. Not in the mineral profiles. In the structure scans. At 11 kilometers, 4 of the 6 drones had found cavities. Not natural cavities. Not stress fractures or volcanic vents or the kind of irregular chambers geology produced when left alone for a few million years. These had right angles. Flat planes. Material density mismatches between wall and surrounding stone. One chamber measured over 400 meters across. Another showed segmented substructures in a pattern no blind mineral process would ever choose. Aaron put down his coffee and did not touch it again. He pulled up the Concord's public geological record for the same coordinates. Solid rock. Uniform density. No chambers. No manufactured material. Nothing. He overlaid the 2 profiles and felt his stomach go cold in a way no weather system on Veros 9 had yet achieved. The public record was not a little wrong. It described a different reality entirely. The difference between them was not measurement error. It was architecture. It was intention. For a long time he just sat there looking at the scans. The engineering bay around him went on with its usual life. Printer beds cycling. Weld arrays ticking cool. 2 systems techs arguing near the far wall about particulate shielding tolerances. The colony itself continuing just beyond the bay doors with its markets and school schedules and food queues and all the ordinary improbable machinery of people who had kept going too long to stop now. Under all of it, 11 kilometers down, were walls. Manufactured walls. Aaron opened a secure local partition and began copying everything. Raw drone data. Comparative overlays. Density analyses. Public record contradictions. Every packet, every log, every timestamp. He worked the way he always worked when reality developed sharp edges. Methodically, with his body held still enough that only the hands moved. Panic was useless. Procedure built things. He copied until the secure partition was full, opened another, copied again, then routed the entire stack into the independent line Lena Vey had told him to use only if he ever found something that mattered more than immediate survival. He found himself saying the old line out loud to the empty room. "We've worked with worse." It landed dead. For the first time since setting foot on Veros 9, he did not believe it even as a morale tool. He looked once more at the right-angle chambers beneath a world that the Concord had described as barren, natural, and uninhabited. Then he sent the files to Lena. 3 hours later, in her embassy quarters beneath the artificial calm of Concord fountains and engineered comfort, Ambassador Lena Vey opened the deep strata scans and finally saw the missing piece of the crime she had suspected from the moment the gift was offered. And once she saw it, she understood with dreadful completeness that Veros 9 had not only been chosen to kill humanity. It had been chosen because someone had already used it that way before. Lena Vey spent 17 days building the indictment. Not drafting it, building it. Drafting implied uncertainty, as though the shape of the thing might still be negotiable. By the time Aaron Solis's deep strata scans reached her secure relay, uncertainty had been reduced to mechanics. The question was no longer whether the Concord had buried something beneath Veros 9. The question was how many times they had done it, how carefully, and how much proof she could place beyond their reach before they realized the clock had started. She made coffee, turned off the artificial fountain audio in her quarters, and began. The first layer was Veros 9 itself. Public geological record against Aaron's drone scans. Public biosphere record against the restricted atmospheric packet. Colonial sovereignty articles against the buried jurisdiction clause in Article 7, subsection C. Gift language against casualty projections. Every falsehood laid beside the truth in clean patient columns until the difference between them stopped being arguable and became structural. The second layer took longer. She pulled 6 old survey archives first, then 10, then 17 worlds total through channels that had each cost her something different over the last 3 years. Different contacts. Different jurisdictions. Different reasons for trust. Some files were partial, some degraded, some written in translation chains old enough to blur meaning at the edges. It did not matter. The pattern held. World after world, the same signature. Historical survey data showing habitable or near-habitable status. Evidence of pre-Concord intelligent life or active settlement. Current classifications pushed into the upper bands of lethality. Resource corridors folded quietly into Concord-controlled logistics. Deep strata anomalies where someone had later bothered to look. And between those points, always the same administrative silence. No wars. No annexation declarations. No openly recorded exterminations. Just ecological intervention. Reclassification. That was the genius of it. The Concord, and before it the predecessor body from which it had inherited its authority and most of its habits, had not destroyed civilizations in ways that looked like destruction. They had turned worlds against the species living on them, then waited for geology and bureaucracy to finish the cleanup. Not fast enough to become scandal. Slow enough to become landscape. She found the oldest Veros 9 archive on the 4th day. 803 years old. Survey class 3. Breathable atmosphere. Complex biosphere. Native intelligence assessed as emergent, technologically capable, strategically inconvenient. The species name appeared in transliteration and again in self-reference. Lena stared at the word for a long time. From which, over centuries of bureaucratic smoothing and strategic forgetting, Veros 9's present designation had clearly been derived. The world had kept the sound of its people after the Concord's predecessor body had decided not to keep the people themselves. The historical intervention record was buried under 3 archive migrations and 1 Reform-era classification shuffle that clearly had not anticipated anyone comparing geological timelines to resource corridor maps 8 centuries later. The language was careful in the old way. Very scientific. Very administrative. Very proud of its restraint. Targeted biosphere simplification. Neural destabilization retroviral vectors. Cognitive reduction without extinction. Long-term ecological downgrade acceptable for strategic corridor acquisition. Lena did not react immediately. That was one of the private things she had learned in 23 years of diplomacy. The worst truths did not usually arrive as emotional impacts. They arrived as arrangements. Pieces clicking together into a structure that had always existed and was only now becoming visible enough to name. The Keth had not vanished. They had been reduced. Their cities buried. Their records erased. Their descendants turned into the vast migrating creatures crossing Veros 9's plains under the Concord's sanitized category of native megafauna. The ground beneath Aaron's colony was not merely a geological anomaly. It was a sealed civilization. That was when Lena understood exactly what the Concord would do next. They would quarantine the world. Not because of medical concern. Not really. Because Amara existed. Because Aaron's scans existed. Because once one Class 15 gift started producing children who could breathe and evidence that could speak, the whole architecture was in danger. She checked 3 internal committee channels, then a 4th, and found the motion already moving. Article 19 Emergency Quarantine Framework. Restricted communications. External contact suspension. Enforcement fleet authorized under anomalous biological development provisions. The language was elegant enough to pass in polite company. The intent was blunt enough to smell. She had 11 days before launch. So she stopped building the case for herself and began building it for the galaxy. The document reached 63 pages. She kept it bloodless. No outrage. No rhetoric. No adjectives she could not defend. 17 worlds. Historical habitability records. Deep strata chamber signatures. Ecological intervention chronology. Resource corridor acquisition dates. Reclassification timelines. Current world statuses. The Keth on Veros 9 as the cleanest demonstrated case. The colony's casualty record. Amara's atmospheric tolerance. The quarantine vote margin. The identities of the 4 delegates who opposed it and had been quietly moved into review isolation within the hour. At the end she added coordinates. All 17 worlds. Every site where anyone with a drill, a scanner, and enough courage could go look for themselves. Then she prepared the release. Not one transmission. Many. 12 formats. 11 major languages. 47 translation keys. 1 version for scientific networks. 1 for legal institutions. 1 for independent media. 1 strip to pure data for historians and archivists who trusted nothing but primary source structure. And 1 smaller companion file sent only to species governments and cultural archives whose own historical records contain suspicious, mythic extinction gaps. She titled that one simply, Names of the Dead. The relay chain woke like something that had been sleeping with one eye open for years. Research stations. Freight hubs. Diplomatic backchannels. Minor species civic networks the Concord had always underestimated because underestimation was one of Empire's laziest habits. Everywhere the document landed, it carried the same quiet force. Here is what was done. Here's where. Here's when. Here is the world they gifted humanity after using it once already. By the time the quarantine fleet launched, the truth was already ahead of it. And on Veros 9, before the first Concord vessel even entered local transit range, Aaron Solis received Lena's warning packet. Fleet incoming, 14 vessels, 3 weeks out. He read it once. Then read the attachment beneath it. Not her evidence file. He had already seen enough of that to understand the scale. The last line. They expect a colony on its knees. Show them what you built. Aaron made coffee. Finished the structural calculation he was already in the middle of. Then called for a colony-wide assembly. Because if the next phase had arrived, then everyone deserved the full shape of the truth before they decided how to stand inside it. The fleet dropped out of transit at dawn. Not Concord dawn. Nobody on Veros 9 had used Concord time in over a year. The colony had built its own clock around the planet's 18-hour turn and the peculiar brown-violet light that spread across the basin just before the upper atmosphere finished deciding what kind of violence it intended for the day. The teachers had named that hour Kethrise as a joke in the school dome. The children kept using it until the adults gave up and followed them, which was how language often worked in real places. At Kethrise on day 11 of the warning window, 14 Concorde vessels came into orbit above a world they had expected to find exhausted, dependent, and small. Fleet Commander Dravin stood at the observation screen of his flagship and felt, before he had fully processed the visuals, that the briefing picture in his mind was wrong. He had reviewed the colony profile twice during approach. 6 original domes. Population attrition within expected range for a non-viable environment. Limited industrial footprint. Manageable enforcement conditions once communications quarantine was established. A 3-year-old settlement on a Class 15 world was supposed to look temporary from orbit, like a wound trying not to become a scar. What he was looking at was not temporary. The thermal signature alone was enough to disrupt the shape of his assumptions. The colony's footprint had tripled. The dome cluster no longer ended at 6. It had become 19 interconnected structures spread over 11 square kilometers, stitched together by enclosed corridors and shielded by a perimeter layout no Concorde colonial template had ever authorized, because no Concorde colonial template had ever assumed humans would be idiotic enough or competent enough to keep expanding on a world like this. Magnify Basin North Quadrant, Dravin said. The display obeyed. Power signatures bloomed across the screen. The energy output exceeded the original cargo manifest by a factor that suggested local manufacturing, material recovery, and infrastructure adaptation far beyond what a dying colony should have been able to sustain. Greenhouse heat. Fabrication clusters. Water recycling towers. A second and third generation of support systems layered atop the first-wave structures like growth rings. He asked for comparison with the last observation report. 6 weeks earlier, the colony had been smaller by 2 domes and 1 full corridor arm. They had been building right up until the fleet arrived. That was not the behavior of a settlement waiting to be erased. That was the behavior of a people still budgeting for next year. Ground optical, Dravin said. The camera feed descended through the atmosphere and stabilized over the eastern perimeter. 5 humans stood at the edge of the deterrent line in full environment gear, motionless except for minor shifts of stance under Vero's gravity. Beyond them, at a distance that should have triggered every tactical instinct in his body, a migration cluster of native megafauna had come to a halt. 12-meter bodies. Dense hide. Window-bright eyes catching the weak dawn. Enough mass to turn emergency barriers into scrap. The deterrent field was off. The creatures were still not advancing. They stood and watched the humans. The humans watched them back. Nothing moved. Nothing attacked. The silence between them was specific. Not absence. Arrangement. Dravin had run 3 quarantine operations in his career. He knew the look of instability. He knew the look of collapse, of populations 1 bad week away from disorder. He also knew the look of negotiated space. This was negotiated space. His tactical officer, who had not yet learned to distrust official briefings at the correct professional depth, said, "Sir, colony has not responded to first hail." "They heard it," Dravin replied. "Send again." On the surface, Aaron Solis took the second hail because the first had arrived while he was halfway through a load balance review for Dome 12's Western Support Spine, and he had not been willing to leave the numbers wrong while a fleet was still 30 seconds from becoming immediate. He finished the calculation, saved it, picked up his coffee, then accepted the channel. Dravin's screen filled with a broad-shouldered man in work clothes with dust on the sleeves, gray at the temples, holding a mug like the conversation would proceed on his schedule if anyone intended to talk to him at all. The background behind him was not a command center in any dramatic sense. It was an engineering office with exposed conduit, stacked material tags, and 1 wall full of ongoing maintenance notes. Whatever authority he possessed came not from performance but from accumulated use. Colony Administrator Solis, Dravin said. "This is Fleet Commander Dravin of the Concorde Quarantine Task Group. Under Article 19 authority, I am required to inform you that Veros 9 is being placed under provisional medical quarantine pending." "I know why you're here," Aaron said. "No hostility. No fear. No theatrics. Just a statement landing in the channel with the weight of something already lived with." Dravin said nothing. Aaron took a sip of coffee, set the mug down outside the camera frame, and continued. You should know Ambassador Lena Vey released the full evidentiary archive 14 days ago. Veros 9, the Keth, the 17 worlds, the reclassification timelines, the quarantine vote. If your sister works in biology, or your brother-in-law is a historian, or your old academy roommate married someone in independent legal review, you've probably seen some version of it by now. That was a hell of a way to open a negotiation. It was also uncomfortably accurate. Draven had received the document from his sister 9 days earlier with a note attached that said only, "Read this and then decide whether your uniform still knows what it thinks it means." He had read it, then read it again, then spent 4 hours staring at nothing in his cabin while the ship continued its lawful approach toward an unlawful purpose. Aaron went on. "I'm not going to threaten you. I don't have anything to threaten you with. What I have is a colony that was sent here to stop existing and didn't. I have engineers and medics and farmers and a school and a market and 3 theoretical physicists who still haven't agreed on anything useful in 6 months. I have records of what this planet is and what was done to it and to the people who were here before us. And I have 50,000 human beings alive on a world your government chose because it thought we would not be." The channel stayed open. On Draven's bridge, no one moved. Aaron looked directly into the camera. "I don't know you, Commander, but I think you should talk to your captains before you decide anything." Then he reached off frame, picked up the mug again, and added in the same practical voice he had used for everything else. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." The channel closed. That line, "Take your time," was the line that followed Draven into the captain's conference and sat there in the middle of the room like an additional participant. 12 captains under his command. 12 private channels opening. 12 faces appearing on the tactical wall in the pale, hard light of a military system built for obedience and suddenly discovering the inconvenience of conscience. He did not issue an order first. That was, in its small way, the beginning of the end. Instead he said, "You have all seen the external document?" Silence answered him first. Then one captain nodded. Then another. Then Commander Velos of the 3rd Escort, whose people maintained history in layered oral archive instead of official stone and had therefore spent centuries being described by the Concord as culturally rich and evidentially unreliable, said, "Yes." Her face on the screen was still in the specific way people got when they had already crossed a private threshold and were waiting for the room to catch up. "My grandmother's line keeps a story," she said, "about a city called the place the ground remembers. We were told it was myth. It appears it was geology." No one laughed. Captain Aruin of the 5th said, "My partner forwarded the file 3 days ago. I confirmed 2 of the resource corridor dates independently. The data holds." Captain Solmare, usually the most doctrinal officer in the group, said nothing for so long Draven thought the channel had frozen. Then, if the record is accurate, Article 19 authority in this instance is derivative of a governance framework built on concealed extermination. I do not see how lawful execution survives contact with that. This was not how captains' calls were supposed to sound. They were supposed to produce alignment, clarify orders, distribute force. Instead, one by one, his officers laid down the reasons obedience had become structurally impossible. Not emotional reasons. Not even political ones, not exactly. Foundational ones. 7 of the 12 said outright that they would not enforce quarantine conditions against the colony. The remaining 5 did not offer support. They offered silence. In the military, silence during a poll like that was not agreement. It was refusal too proud or too frightened to name itself yet. Draven ended the call and sat alone in the command chair for a long minute with the tactical feed of Veros 9 rotating slowly before him. Below that atmosphere, a school would be in session. A market would be opening. Somewhere, because the file had mentioned it and the detail had lodged like shrapnel, a jazz musician was probably playing badly in a corridor with terrible acoustics. The firing order arrived at 1,400 hours. Priority channel. Concord seal. Language concise enough to be final. Enforce quarantine. Disable unauthorized communication arrays. Prepare selective surface compliance action if colonial resistance continues. Orbital strikes authorized under emergency provision if perimeter defense systems interfere. Draven read the order once. Then he read it again, more slowly, as if there might be some alternate meaning hidden in the familiar machinery of command. There was not. He stood, carried the order to the bridge, and looked at the crew who had served under him long enough to know the difference between hesitation and judgment. "The firing order has been received," he said. The room held still. "I am not going to execute it." No one spoke. He continued in the same voice. "Any officer who wishes to file formal objection may do so. I will preserve each objection in full and attach my name to the record personally." He waited. The command board blinked patiently with the unexecuted order. No one moved to challenge him. Not one. Only then did Draven open a direct channel back to the surface. Aaron Solis answered on the first hail this time. "Colony Administrator," Draven said, "this is Fleet Commander Draven. The quarantine order will not be enforced. I am requesting a secure communication channel between my fleet and your administration outside Concord Authority for the purpose of coordinating what happens next." He paused. Then, because there are moments when a person can either become smaller than the truth or speak inside it, "I apologize for the circumstances that brought us here." There was a short silence. Then Aaron said, "Noted." But this time the word carried something warmer than deflection. Something almost like welcome. What followed was not a war. For a while, that disappointed the people outside the story who had not lived any of it. They wanted fleets turning on fleets, dramatic declarations, a clean hour in which evil was recognized, named, and blasted out of orbit. They wanted the kind of justice that arrived hot and left obvious wreckage behind it. What happened instead was slower, more exhausting, and much harder to fake. The Concorde did not collapse under bombardment. It collapsed under evidence. Lena Vey's 63 pages moved through the independent networks faster than the Concorde's containment offices could classify them. Then they moved through public systems. Then through academic archives. Then through the private channels of mid-level administrators who had spent careers inside Concorde structures and had developed the dangerous habit of recognizing the difference between complicated and dishonest. The first open hearings began 6 months after Draven's refusal. The first independent tribunal was authorized in year 2. By year 3, the phrase ecological intervention had disappeared from polite official language and been replaced, in document after document, by what it had always actually meant: erasure. The Old Speakers Coalition tried at first to hold the line through procedure, delay, review, committee reassignment, jurisdictional challenges, translation disputes over old surveys, questions about archive integrity, questions about chain of custody, questions about whether the evidence really established intent or merely unfortunate historical patterns. The questions were clever. The questions were professional. The questions had been enough, for 400 years, to keep terrible things inside sealed rooms until the people they hurt had died far away from wherever the minutes were being taken. They were not enough anymore. Because Veros 9 existed in present tense. That was the part the Concorde had not understood when they chose it. A hidden grave could still be denied. A dead world could still be filed. A missing civilization could still be pushed into myth. But a living human colony standing on top of the grave with schools and hydroponics and medbays and children and 5,000 pages of maintenance logs and 3 years of casualty data and one impossible infant breathing local air turned all abstraction into embarrassment. The evidence was not archival anymore. It had a market on Tuesdays. It had perimeter maps. It had a jazz musician with terrible acoustics and 10 different witness statements describing the sound. The Concorde's 4 dissenting delegates were restored to full session authority in year 2 of the tribunal process. 3 of them returned grim and professional and immediately unpleasant to everyone who had counted on their silence staying procedural. The 4th, Delegate Saran Vale, walked into the public media office on the 3rd day after reinstatement and released the full internal quarantine debate under his own name. He attached a single statement. A government that must hide the record from the governed has already answered the moral question. The old speaker, Oren Tall, was removed from active authority 11 months later. He did not fight the removal. That was the strange dignity of him, and perhaps the most useful thing he ever did. When questioned in open session, he answered carefully and accurately. He explained the frame he had operated in: corridor stability, resource continuity, civilization scale management, necessary sacrifice distributed at distances the public did not need to hold in its immediate emotional field. He spoke the logic plainly, perhaps believing still that clear explanation would reveal its necessity. Instead, stripped of grandeur, it revealed only age and cowardice in expensive clothes. The tribunal found not merely that the decisions had been monstrous, but that the governing frame itself had been built to make monstrosity sound responsible. That finding mattered more than his removal. On Veros 9, life continued while the galaxy argued. That was another thing nobody outside the story fully appreciated. Reform and survival were running at the same time. While legal chambers on the core worlds debated sovereignty clauses and succession law, Aaron Solis was still signing off on support loads for Dome 17. Priya Nwosu was still adjusting med rotations. Raji Menon was still trying to make car salad taste less like failure processed through leaves. Lena, 14 now and taller than Aaron's shoulder, was still spending too much time with Felix's field team and coming home with migration maps on her tablet and new opinions about megafauna cognition every week. Marcus Webb kept playing. He got better, which upset several people who had become fond of him being terrible. Lena arrived on Veros 9 in Year 2 aboard the first independent transport cleared under Provisional Review Authority. Aaron met her at the primary airlock wearing work clothes and carrying a cup of coffee that was, by any objective standard available to chemistry, bad. She drank it without complaint. "We've worked with worse," he said. She smiled for the first time in 3 days of transit and answered, "We have." The reclassification took another 8 years. Not because anyone doubted what Veros 9 was by then, but because Law was a machine older than any person in the room, and changing machines from the inside took longer than most species liked to admit. There were 3 separate legal traditions involved. 5 sovereignty models. 2 committee collapses. 1 truly astonishing argument over whether a world could be simultaneously recognized as historically occupied, currently inhabited, biologically transformed, and fully independent without creating precedent problems for 14 other active claims. Lena sat through every one of those meetings with the same calm face she had worn the day she accepted the gift. This time, she was not alone. Scientific delegations from species once classified as administratively minor now arrived with their own dead worlds and their own archives. Historians cross-indexed the names of lost cities. Biologists tracked biosphere retroviral signatures across a dozen former corridor acquisitions. The Keth were named publicly in the Hall of Concord for the first time in 800 years. When the final language came down, it was ugly with compromise and still more honest than anything the Concord had written in centuries. Veros 9. Class 1 for adapted human habitation. Sovereign. Independent. Recognized as occupied by right of survival, continuity, and documented administrative bad faith on the part of the former granting authority. Human beings, in the end, had not simply inherited Veros 9. They had outlived the lie that offered it. On the morning the decision was announced, Amara Dada was 11 years old. She stood at the far eastern perimeter just before Kethrise with her helmet tucked beneath one arm and the dawn light turning the layered atmosphere brown, violet, and bruised gold at the edges. She had been born in the medbay during a storm and had spent her entire life breathing air that should not have let her exist. To the colony, she was still partly a child and partly an argument. To herself, she was just someone who preferred the perimeter in the morning when the migration passed close and the world had not yet filled with everyone else's schedules. The largest of the megafauna stood across the field line watching her. Builder, the children had named it years ago, and the name had held because the creature carried itself with the weight of something that had once known structures. It was older than the colony. Older, probably, than any memory that still had words attached to it. Its broad head turned slightly as Amara set down her helmet. The announcement came softly through the comm clipped to her suit. Official language. Legal closure. Independent status. Sovereignty recognized. Behind her, from the direction of the main domes, the colony answered the news not with speeches but with sound. Doors opening. Voices rising. Someone in market corridor laughing too loudly. A fabrication alarm silenced halfway through its own cycle. And somewhere, because some things were now constitutional in their inevitability, Marcus Webb beginning to play into bad acoustics. Amara reached up, released the neck seals, and lifted off the helmet. The unfiltered air of Vero's 9 touched her face. Hostile upper layers. Wrong chemistry. Cinnamon from the root mats. Cold mineral bite beneath it. She breathed in. Builder watched her. For a moment nothing moved. Not because nothing was there, but because some silences were too full to disturb quickly. Between them lay all the things no reform chamber could undo. The buried cities. The reduced minds. The centuries of being renamed into landscape. The years of human dead. The years of work. The years of proving that a world chosen as an ending could still become a beginning if enough stubborn people refused to die on cue. Amara could not give the Keth back what had been taken. No one could. But she could stand there, breathing the air of the world that had once tried to kill her species and had failed, and let that fact exist in full daylight. Builder shifted its weight, turned with slow, impossible grace, and led the migration east along the route the ground remembered. Amara watched until the last of them disappeared into the brown-violet light. Then she picked up her helmet, turned toward the domes, and walked back to the sound of 50,000 people living ordinary, improbable lives on a planet that had been built to erase them and had instead become their home.